if we think of firms, they don't seek to impose externalities on others, such as air pollution, water pollution, ground pollution, just for fun or because they're simply people of bad character. They do so because it's financially advantageous to do so. If a firm can avoid paying some of the costs associated with production without much affecting their revenue, it will be profitable to avoid paying or externalizing some costs. Since it's a central goal of a firm to make profit, ideally to maximize profit, it's reasonable to expect that they will do so. If you're playing the game of competing in a market, then these are the parameters within which you must work. It's not a matter of character, it's a matter of the system in which characters exist and operate. We might think, well, is it different for different kinds of market structures? Well, if we think of markets in which there are high barriers to entry, such as in the case of monopolies and oligopolies, lower costs entail higher profits, both in the short run and in the long run. But what about competitive markets? Because we know that in a competitive market, where there are very many players, everyone's producing a very similar product, there are no barriers to entry. Well, in the short run, it's the same. Lower costs entail higher profits. But in the long run, it's necessary to produce at the lowest possible cost that a firm can in order to remain viable in that market, because rivals will certainly be choosing to produce at the lowest average cost and sell at the lowest price they can. No one's making any economic profit here, but everyone is driven by the nature of this competitive market to lower their costs as far as they can in order to avoid losing all of their market share. Thus, it doesn't really matter what the market structure is that we're looking at. Firms have an interest in creating uncompensated, unaccounted externalities insofar as it involves using production methods that are less costly to them compared to less environmentally destructive or humanly destructive production methods. Now, in textbooks, externalities are often presented as kind of like unfortunate accidents or unintended consequences of the actions of firms. It can be of consumers too. But as is argued in the video we're going to see, correctly I think, we can go further than that. Firms knowingly and actively seek to externalize what might normally be regarded as internal costs. This includes not just the standard textbook examples of the costs of pollution, but the costs of all sorts of things that firms need in order to generate profit. For example, building infrastructure such as roads, railways, communications networks. In the 19th century, many companies did this for themselves. But over time, they figured out so it was a cost that they had to bear themselves. It was internal to the firm. But over time, they figured out ways in which to get others to pay for the infrastructure that they needed, namely taxpayers. It's also the case in the example, especially in the United States, but in other countries certainly as well in the modern period. military support for overseas investments. Hundreds of years ago, well, up until the 19th century, you had some private corporations who had their own military support, so to speak. The Dutch East India Company, for example, is a classic example of that. But again, over time, companies have found ways of taxpayers providing that military support for their overseas investments so that they don't have to pay for them. They externalize that cost. So let's have a little quick snippet of this video. It's called The Corporation.
To whom do these companies owe loyalty? What does loyalty mean? Well, it turns out that was a rather naive concept anyway, as corporations are always owed obligation to themselves to get large and to get profitable. In doing this, it tends to be more profitable to the extent it can make other people pay the bills for its impact on society. There's a terrible word that economists use for this called externalities.
An externality is the effect of a transaction between two individuals on a third party who has not consented to or played any role in the carrying out of that transaction. And there are real problems in that area, there's no doubt about it.
Running a business is a tough proposition. There are costs to be minimized at every turn. And at some point, the corporation says, let somebody else deal with that. Let's let somebody else supply the military power to the Middle East to protect the oil at its source. Let's let somebody else build the roads that we can drive these automobiles on. Let's let somebody else have those problems. And that is where externalities come from. That notion of let somebody else deal with that. I got all I can handle myself.
A corporation is an externalizing machine in the same way that a shark is a killing machine. Each one is designed in a very efficient way to accomplish particular objectives. In the achievement of those objectives, there isn't any question of malevolence or of will. The enterprise has within it, and the shark has within it, those characteristics that enable it to do that for which it was designed.
So the pressure's on the corporation to deliver results now and to externalize any cost that this unwary or uncaring public will allow it to externalize.
Okay, let's think about consumers rather than firms. Consumers may impose externalities on others if it's advantageous for them to do so. That is, if it adds to their net private benefits to engage in this externalizing behaviour. So it might, for example, be littering or creating large amounts of household garbage, which is perhaps a more serious problem than the littering. I'll give you a little example. So my son has a desktop oven and it got really, really dirty. So he hadn't cleaned it for yonks. And he said that he was going to throw out the desktop oven and just go down to Kmart and buy a new one because they had a new one on special for $20. I said, well, why not just clean it rather than go and buy a new one? To which he replied, it would take me 2 hours to clean this oven. I value that 2 hours doing something else more highly than $20. So it would be rational for me to devote my time to engaging in other activities, like being with friends or playing internet games or something like that. That's worth more than $20 to me, rather than spending the time cleaning the oven. Okay? So it's more rational for me to go and buy a new oven for $20. Now, the side effect of that is that you create this negative externality. It's created household waste which would never otherwise have existed. Now, that's just one example, and that's happening all across Australia, in all households, in various different ways for various different products. It's happening all the time. Those sorts of decisions get made. That's basically the explanation for a motive. But let's think about that for a sec. Although we can think of, say, littering or creating household garbage as a choice, it might be thought that consumers sometimes have no choice about creating garbage, especially within the household. Almost everything that you buy involves the creation of waste somewhere along the line. Right? Every product that you purchase at the supermarket or the corner store or wherever is going to come wrapped in some kind of plastic or cardboard, for example. Right? And you can't keep that around. You will have to throw it out. So it seems like, you could argue, that sometimes we have no option but to create this external cost for the rest of society as individuals. Now, from a theoretical perspective, this is not really true. A household could choose to reduce its total consumption, or at least reduce consumption of wrapped products, for example, and thereby reduce its creation of garbage. Or it could produce its own in-house products. Instead of reducing consumption, just produce its own products in-house. So you can have a vegetable garden or something like that. But these options are likely to reduce a household's total net benefits, and so most households will choose not to do these sorts of things. But we can certainly say that it is a kind of an option which is expressed sometimes quite fervently by some people. But you will tend to notice that those people are wealthy. They have the wherewithal to change their mode of consumption in some way. But it's unlikely to be as true for poorer households. For households that are really struggling to make ends meet, they may simply not be able to afford to buy more expensive products that generate less waste or that do less environmental harm, such as, using solar power. You're going to buy the solar power panels and so on. People who are just struggling week to week to make ends meet don't have the $4,000 to $5,000 to $10,000 set aside for putting in solar panels or something like that, or fundamentally changing their lives in some way. It's not really an option for them. It is an option for people who are wealthier, who have the wherewithal financially to do so. This kind of admonition of the poor to be more environmentally friendly is a bit like the kind of eat healthy complaints that are made about the poor, when the only food that they can really afford is high processed, high sugar, high fat food. So poor households, while it's notionally a choice, it's not really a serious option. Much like if someone gives you the choice between you can have a Mars bar or cut off your hand. The second option's not really a serious one. There's no genuine choice being offered here. So when we think about externalities, especially when we come to households, we also need to consider the issue of income and wealth inequality as well. This is leaving aside the fact that poorer households tend to live in areas where where there's pollution from factories and so on. That's on top of the externalities that they themselves engage in. Anyway, here's a video which talks about this issue. Not so much the inequality, but the inequality is clearly implicit in it.
Always busy, always bustling. Mumbai is a city on the move. Home to factories, industry, 21 million people, and a lot of rubbish. It generates 10,000 metric tons of waste a day. Problem is, there's no real way to get rid of it. Much of it ends up here at the Devnar dumping ground on the edge of the city.
There's so much garbage over here. It smells really bad, and to be honest, it's quite hard to breathe. And if you look at this hill behind me, this isn't actually a hill. It's 90 years of accumulated garbage. From ground level, it's as high as a 10-story building.
This was a wetland swamp. There were beautiful mangroves and...
This area was once green?
Absolutely, yeah.
Now activists say it's a national embarrassment and a hazard. Part of the dump recently caught fire. A fire so big with so much smoke, it was visible from space. You see the sun today? This man asks me. He lives across the dumping ground. That day, you couldn't see it. It was all black.
Why does this area catch fire?
See, I mean, if you look around over here, the materials are clearly combustible. This is mixed waste. You're seeing a lot of plastic, a lot of combustible material over there. And once it has baked in the sun, it is completely dried. Then it becomes absolutely right for being a fire to start.
He says Devnar should have been shut years ago. We asked the head of the local city council what her plans for the dumping ground are. She said they've ramped up a citywide cleanliness campaign and started diverting some of the waste to another area. But the ultimate goal?
To scientifically cover the dump or to remove it or biomine, So for that, we are in the process of, finalizing the tenders and the people with whom we will be working.
She admits that could take a while. As India continues to project itself as a growing superpower, dumps like these are eyesores that critics say contradict its ambitious message. Malika Kapoor, CNN, Mumbai.
Finally, let's think about how consumers and firms can sometimes work hand in glove to create externalities. Now, we know that firms sometimes build products that are designed to break down and therefore will have to be thrown away and replaced. And they'll do that in order to increase demand for their products and therefore revenue for their products and therefore hopefully profits. Now, of course, this creates a negative externality. It creates waste, technically, on the part of the consumer because the consumer is throwing away a product which no longer works. And this is what we'd call physical obsolescence. But there's also psychological obsolescence, in which consumers choose to throw away unbroken products in order to buy updated, better versions. This creates additional waste, a further externality imposed on society. Now, this benefits consumers, obviously, because it increases demand for their product. But unlike physical obsolescence, consumers actually want to throw away a fully functioning product simply so that they can enjoy the benefits of being fashionable and up to date. So let's look at a video, it's an Australian video, about exactly that.
Here at Apple, our most ingenious and lucrative invention often gets overlooked. We call it the pentalobe screw. It's the screw that screws you.
The pentalobe screw is a screw in the base of the iPhone, and pretty much it's just there to stop people from opening the phone.
And what would happen if I tried to repair this myself?
People try and pry up the antenna connector here. You pry up the battery. That'll lift all these pads off the logic board here.
And what happens if you do that at home?
Well, then it's stuffed.
Okay, and can you repair that then?
No, it's not. It really is stuffed.
You can't? No. Why do you think products like this are difficult to repair?
I think Apple doesn't want them repaired. I think that they make them difficult especially so that people will buy new ones.
Why are our products so difficult to repair? We call it a business model, and it follows in a great tradition. It's called planned obsolescence. Planned obsolescence is the deliberate design of products to limit their lifespan.
It all started in the 1930s when manufacturers joined forces to ensure light bulbs lasted no more than 1,000 hours. And by the 1950s, companies were realizing they could do this with all kinds of things. Nylon stockings used to be strong enough to tow a car. But then the engineers were asked to weaken them so women would buy more pairs and men would buy more tow bars. Soon manufacturers were doing this with all kinds of things, putting cheap, flimsy plastic parts in washing machines and putting heat-sensitive parts in places where they'd get hot.
The practice was never widespread, but it wasn't uncommon either. Instead of consumers repairing things, it became normal to replace them. And it's still happening today. Just imagine if everything worked like that.
So what's the problem?
My husband can't see.
We recommend you get a new husband. Oh, it's okay. We have new models.
Oh, great! I like the green one.
Green one's very popular.
Oh.
Today, the products we buy encourage us to get rid of them. Indicator bristles on toothbrushes tell you to stop using them. Razors with indicator strips tell you to change blades, even though the strip doesn't know how blunt the razor is. Even pillows tell us that they want to be thrown out. Don't do it, pillow! No! Oh. Printer cartridges that demand to be replaced when they're 40% full. Printers that give you an error message after a certain number of pages. But now there's an even better way of getting people to replace their old stuff. And it's not making old products unusable. It's making people not want to use them. Throwing away perfectly functional items just because they've gone out of style. In 2008, Australians threw away 16.8 million televisions and computers. Most of them still worked. All of them contained toxic material. Only 10% were recycled, and those discarded made up 70% of the heavy metals in our landfill. You weren't supposed to clap that. Australians have more than 22 million mobile phones at home that they no longer use, and the average handset's used for just 18 months. It's not the engineers who make things obsolete now, it's the marketers. We live in an age of psychological obsolescence. It's by no means the only one, but what's a good example of psychological obsolescence? We call it the iPad. Inside the first iPad is a mounting that seems specifically designed to hold a camera just like the one in MacBooks. But when the iPad came out with no camera, cynics speculated it seemed to be deliberately held back for the iPad 2. And no wonder that early adopters of the iPad 3 whined so much, it was superseded after just 7 months by the iPad 4. At this rate, we're building the most stylish, easy-to-use mountain of landfill ever. Which is why governments around the world are introducing product stewardship laws to make companies more responsible for their waste. And we've got product stewardship laws in Australia too. They came in 2011. It's designed to work voluntarily, but each year products that might possibly be regulated can be named by the Environment Minister. So how good are Australia's product stewardship rules?
It is a defensible act. I really would like the decisions to be made on the level of environmental impact.
But it's not just up to industry. It's also up to us as consumers.
I would certainly urge people not to keep switching over models because they've bought a digital TV and someone's brought out some new, slightly improved system.
Product stewardship legislation might encourage manufacturers to build more durable products.
But it won't stop people trading in their fully functioning products for the newer model. That's up to us.
So why not try sticking with the older, less cool product?
As if.